Now, it's my very great pleasure to introduce to you Tom Rees, Consultant Archaeologist with Rathmell Archaeology Ltd. Tom Rees is a Fellow of the Society and a member of our own society. He became involved in archaeology through School Archaeology Society in Bradford and the Scottish Field School of Archaeology. His interest in prehistory drew him north to Edinburgh University for an archaeological degree, where he met his wife Susan. Since then, he has worked both for commercial archaeology companies and councils, investigating archaeological sites and landscapes of all periods. Starting family life in Fife, a move to Ayrshire came when Tom established Rathmell Archaeology Ltd in 2003. Based in Kilwinning, he continues to work there. Now, I have to say that Hunterston has a particular interest for me because I spent much of my school holidays down in that area playing with cousins and whatnot. That predates the nuclear power station, which is why I don't glow in the dark. Now, Tom delivered this lecture last night in Inverness, and he tells us that the audience were extremely well behaved. So I leave that thought with you, and I would just ask you to give a Glasgow Archaeological Society and Society of Antiquaries of Scotland welcome to Tom Rees.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you this evening. So, as said, my name's Thomas Rees, and I'm a consultant archaeology with Rathmell Archaeology, a consultant archaeologist with Rathmell Archaeology. We've got offices in Ayrshire and Dundee. And this evening, I wanted to go through with you a working interpretation for a site we've excavated at Hunterston in Ayrshire. This was undertaken by a colleague of mine, Douglas Gordon, so I'm going to grossly misrepresent his findings and understanding of the site, as is traditional when you present somebody else's site. And I may in time come to regret some of the things I present to you this evening, especially as it's filmed, and so for posterity you can bring it back up and point out what I suggested was what we'll find out. But I think it's incredibly important as a commercial archaeologist that we apply as much academic rigour and exposure to our theories and understandings as we go through the process of understanding and discovering about the sites we've excavated, and apply the current archaeological research frameworks to them. Only through this can we ensure that we do proper credit to the archaeological sites we investigate. Now, to give you some development background, I am a commercial archaeologist, so I was not there for academic reasons. Our work at Hunterston was driven by the needs of the Western Link. This is a £1 billion investment project, a combination of the National Grid and Scottish Power Transmission, who are constructing a subsea direct current cable from Hunterston to Deeside. This is an incredible logistical undertaking and is there to enable renewable energy from Scotland to be transmitted down into the marketplace that will use that electricity, which is predominantly the conurbations of England. So it's a vast undertaking, and an aspect of that undertaking is a construction site to the rear of the Hunterston nuclear power stations, where converter stations and substations are having to be built, and the start of the cable that ultimately reaches Deeside starts running. So, as with any major project, there's a whole series of organisations involved and whose good works enable me to do this presentation today. We have our clients, SP Transmission and the National Grid, who between them make up Western Link. We have our main contractors, Siemens and Prysmian Group. We have to recognise the environmental advisors, TEP, who kept us all on track, and particularly Joe Somerville at RSK, who was the archaeological consultant on this project. Neither should we forget West of Scotland Archaeology Service, who act on behalf of the Planning Authority, North Ayrshire Council, to ensure that the works delivered were competent, and Paul Robbins there took that role. And I suppose, with regret, I shouldn't ignore all the archaeologists from Rathmell who actually got in the dirt, got muddy, wet, cold, miserable, and they never phoned up to complain. Well, I never took the calls, obviously, because we knew all the numbers. We do have caller display in the office. But there's a huge sea of people involved in the work that I'm going to present this evening, and I would hope it's recognised that I will spread liability onto them extensively for any errors or omission. So, for those of you not familiar, this was more important for the Inverness lecture, you'll appreciate, where Ayrshire lies. We are obviously down on the Clyde coast, a beautiful sunlit land that looks across the Clyde Islands onto the Kintyre coast. Lovely backdrop to our coastal views, never having any foul weather at all. Hunterston itself, for those unfamiliar, sits at the northern return of a promontory to the immediate north of West Kilbride. It's at a very interesting point in the Clyde, where we have the narrowing of the sea lanes as they weave between the Cumbria Islands and the southern tip of Bute, before continuing up past Lags before turning east at Gurk. And to the east, inland of Hunterston, we have the uplands of Muirshiel. So it's a very interesting location in terms of geography and movement. This is an aerial view of our site looking south down the Ayrshire coast, very generously borrowed from the Royal Commission, who kindly made this available. You can see the Western Link site. It's the dirty brown muddy expanse to the rear of the nuclear power stations of Hunterston A and B in the centre of this view. Looking down the coast, you come down to Porton Cross and then on to West Kilbride and Sea Mill, which is down on the shore. And in the immediate foreground, we have Hunterston Sands and the Brigade Point. And behind Hunterston and the Western Link is Goldenberry Hill. And Goldenberry Hill is very important in our story, as we'll come on to see. In terms of understanding the land, I always like starting with William Roy, with his military map of Scotland, 1752 to 55. This shows our peninsula to be at the northern end of the rich arable land of Ayrshire, as that arable land becomes a narrow belt creeping up the Clyde coast. And so there we are, we're a chunk of ground to the north of Goldenberry Hill. We're open rig, the lines you're seeing are showing that it's arable land, but there's no obvious settlement there in the mid-18th century, though I would point out with interest the absence of arable land to the east of that, where we've got some boggy ground, a bit of muir that is not being actively used. So in development archaeology terms, it's quite reasonable to ask why were we asked to undertake archaeological works there? What was the attraction to go looking at what appeared to be just improved grounds of the northern side of this peninsula? Well, one of the first things that really prompted concern was the Hunterston brooch. Held now by the National Museums of Scotland, this was rediscovered in 1826 by two workmen digging drains on Goldenberry Hill. This stunning piece of 8th century Celtic jewellery exhibits Irish, Scottish, English influences, and it's marked with Old Norse runes from the 10th century. Now, the brooch isn't thought to come from the development area, but it's one of a whole series of archaeological discoveries, finds and known sites on the peninsula that really highlights that we can't underestimate, and we couldn't underestimate, the potential of the ground. To the immediate east of our development area is one of a number of medieval and late medieval power centres. These are the 16th and 17th century Hunterston Castle, home of the Hunter clan, who purport to have the first gift of lands there in the 12th century from David I. And ultimately they moved out of these tower houses into a 19th century mansion. We also have Porton Cross, a very short step to the southwest. Again, initially constructed as a hall house in the 14th century for the Boyds of Kilmarnock, who ultimately also went on to abandon their more robust tower house as it was expanded into, moving into a more refined mansion house in Porton Cross. However, unlike Hunterston, this is not the earliest known site we have down at Porton Cross. Rather, that is our 12th to 13th century Old Hill. A castle that dominates the land and seascapes, and Porton Cross itself that stands immediately below it on the shore. And it's a fascinating site, a De Ross castle that is radically different in terms of landscape position to the later sites. It's a very controlling defensive location. And more interestingly for us as we go on with this talk is the fact that it's constructed within an Iron Age hill fort. This is a 1st millennium BC site which is reused in the 12th, 13th century AD. And that reuse shows also a continuity of seeking these defensive dominating positions with absolutely stunning sea views down the Clyde. We have other sites similar to Old Hill, but even more grand if you look across to the southern tip of Butte with the 2 Donegal forts. And we have to understand our location in these contexts. A more recent discovery was made during the Coley survey. This is a very interesting community integrated survey project being undertaken by Wessex Archaeology in conjunction with the organisation formerly known as the Royal Commission, now obviously part of Historic Environment Scotland. They identified on Hunterston sands a series of timbers which were dated to the 13th century AD and they believe come from a coastal tower of some form. They also re-investigated this harbour, which you can see in the centre of this image at Brigade Point, an open hexagonal harbour which they still have not given us the benefit of a definitive date or origin point. But we have these whole series of sites all around this peninsula showing an intensity of activity that gave us a grave pause for concern. So, returning to our development site at the rear of the nuclear power stations, we have a series of gentle sloping, north-facing fields that are obviously improved, having been ploughed before going to pasture, and they contained no substantive known sites, but they're on this peninsula that gives us plenty of cause for concern. And our known unknown, as Donald Rumsfeld would contribute to us, was whether any of this activity extended into the ground. So in true standard development tradition, our first appearance on site was to undertake an archaeological intrusive evaluation. This is a trenching exercise designed to test the landscape for significant archaeological features. We effectively cut a series of trenches in an array and inspect these for evidence of truncated features that have survived beneath the depth of the plough, and for artefacts disturbed from underlying features and integrated into that plough soil. This proved a very successful exercise. We rapidly acquired a collection of struck lithics, prehistoric pottery, and metalworking evidence from across the fields we're looking at. There were also, as well as the concentrations of artefacts, a series of locations where we identified concentrations of features, pits and post holes. These appear quite typically in the sand and gravel subsoil as darker filled features where earth-fast timbers or other excavation has happened in the past. These clusters of artefacts and features were taken to mark areas of interest for further work. This is a very normal development sequence, and 4 core areas were then looked at to enable the development to proceed. And I think we were a bit addicted by this point to the idea that you should letter everything at A, B, C, D, not suggesting that there's a whole series of nuclear power stations about to be built, yet to be designed at Hunterston. But it was quite addictive as an approach. So this evening, we really want to talk about only one of these sites. And we want to focus on Area B, which is at the very eastern end of this development area and is to the immediate rear of Hunterston B itself. So this is gently sloping ground, and we found a concentration of features in one of the evaluation trenches close to where there was a slight dip in the ground and where there was an awful lot of damp areas, suggesting an amount of impeded drainage of this field. So within this stage of works, we're no longer working in trenches. Rather, we look to strip very large areas so we can identify features and activity in plan. And the only way to do that is to do groundbreaking on an industrial scale. So no brushes and spoons here. We're definitely in the land of excavators, bulldozers, and spoil management plans, which, as ever when you're excavating to a rear of a nuclear power station, does have a certain number of problems with the amount of linkages we had into the national grid, either passing over us or under us, which always made life a wee bit more interesting, to say the least. So we stripped an area centred on the initial evaluation trench. And that was where we'd found this cluster of pits and post holes. And as we became expanded out from that, it became very readily apparent that the trench had clicked an area of an exceptionally dense array of features. And Every coloured flag you can see on this image is where the archaeologists monitoring the machines have flagged up an individual feature. And it's a huge array. But as we continued doing that, we discovered a very distinct change of an area where we started losing features, but we also lost the subsoil. So after lifting the ploughed soil in this portion of the site, we had a darker, richer organic soil, which was obviously infilling a hollow or depression of some form. And I think this might be slightly better shown in this second image when we're only part way through the strip, where you can see as you go to the left in this image, you move into a much darker, black, rich soil rather than the brown loam of the plough soil or the sandy colour of the subsoil. This proved to be the centre of our site. So this is the extent of Area B, and the dashed and solid lines going around the outside of these features, these are the limits of that black organic soil. They very much overlie the core of our site. And they're showing a very different character to the deposits in this core of our site. That impeded drainage that we had increasingly proved to be a great problem for it. And it was really centred in this core hollow where we had the black organic soil on the otherwise gently sloping field. That waterlogging, it was a great disadvantage, I think, that the work we undertook was in a wet winter and a wet spring. So we were constantly having flooding issues, and the archaeological team really enjoyed this as well. They gave me very positive feedback while requesting more and more gumboots and wondering whether you could get waterproof socks. And I assured them that they were far too expensive for the likes of them, and they really enjoyed it as it was. And what we did is we ended up having to do a huge amount of putting in drainage grips, sumps and pumps just to be able to work this area moving through that winter and spring, which again starts presenting problems for us in understanding why this was the location where we had such a rich archaeological site. Now, what started to emerge in disentangling the volume of features we had was that we had present a whole series of curvilinear features. Now, you can see these on this image arcing from the foreground back towards those archaeologists kneeling in the wet ground, enjoying themselves there in the back of shot. The stones you can see in that arcing feature are packing for upright timbers, and we appear to have a palisaded enclosure or fence. And in fact, we have more than that. We have a whole series of these curvilinear enclosures, which we found again and again arcing around the same portion of the centre of our site. It was a common area they were steadily enclosing, with that enclosure being repeated on multiple occasions. By the end, in terms of phasing those arcing enclosures, we could show 6 phases of enclosure had occurred on this site. All were asymmetrical in plan, several incorporating tails that extended off to the east, and there was a consistent absence of the northeast sections of those patterns of enclosure. The omission of that circuit may be a product of a different construction style for that portion, but we would like to think that actually it's a reflection of an intentional form being created, consistently enclosing or partly enclosing the centre of the site. And that's a liberty I've already taken. I've called it an enclosure, and it doesn't even manage to shut off a space and give you a clear entrance. And there is throughout this a whole series of liberties I will take, and the sharper of you can quiz me at the end as to why I've taken them. Now, after recognising that pattern of enclosure, we also recognised there was another form of enclosure going around the same portion of ground that preceded those curvilinear enclosures. And this was a post-defined enclosure. We had a palisade that was built of timbers. And this formed a sub-rectangular area it enclosed, about approximately 20 metres by 25 metres. And that's the sort of space we're talking about. Area B as a site, I would suggest, would fit pretty much in this lecture theatre, maybe taking out a wee bit more space than it. Now, as we come on, that's not a very big site at all. This post-defined enclosure does form a full circuit, and interestingly, it has formal entrances. In the southeast corner, we had what appeared to be a very grand entranceway, or even a processional way, a massive entrance formed by a series of intercutting post holes that formed two opposed L shapes. This was a structure built on a monumental scale, and it formed a very strident entrance axial to the long axis of our enclosure. Now, the only other features we had on a comparable scale which seemed to immediately associate it were two dumbbell-like features. These were formed by two massive timber post holes, which would have taken very large timbers, with a gully joining between them. These again shared a common access, but were sited within the core of the site. So when you then step back and say, well, what does this look like? This is the form we have for our post-defined enclosure, giving us a much clearer enclosure pattern, the suggestion of a clear common access to the structural elements of it running into the centre of the site. And don't forget, at the centre of our site is that deep, dark, thick, black organic layer, which is filling in what we appear to have as a hollow core. So do not think of this as a level or raised site. Now, within that core area, as we started taking out that dark organic soil, we started getting material culture and objects and structural elements that we started associated with metalworking. The first of this was this very large boulder. Well, it was very large to the people who were obliged to move it, and then demanded that we needed excavation plant to move it, and they weren't putting their backs out for the sake of archaeology, which I have a lot of sympathy for. This very large heat-affected boulder also has an amount of slag adhered to it. So we're immediately thinking that this stone could have been part of a furnace or a smithing hearth. We also recovered a whole range of slags from site. This past portion is a hearth bottom material, which would be the base of a smithing hearth. So ferrous metal, iron being worked on site. So we presumably immediately got good evidence for ironsmithing on this site. We did also get a number of other slags, including some tap slags. So that would suggest we've got smelting on site. Now, before we analyse that tap slag, it's very hard to be confident about what metals are being smelted, but there's the suggestion some of them are non-ferrous, and that there may even be copper tap slags on this site. We have multiple fragments of refractory ceramics. So these are parts of crucibles, most likely used for melting copper alloy prior to casting. And we also have some copper alloy tools that have been cast themselves. On the left, we have a broken tang chisel. This is, and on the right, we've got a portion of a shank of a pin. Both of them are likely to be late Bronze Age in date, and you'd suggest about 900 BC for the date of the chisel. And chisels, in addition, are part of the toolkit used in metalworking. So at this point, we're starting to recognise that we've got craft evidence for metalworking on site in both ferrous and non-ferrous metals. Taking down that dark organic material, we start reaching a conflation layer, a more robust stoned layer. It's not a nice yard floor, but it does appear to be a trample compaction layer that has been stable for some period. And so this suggests a working surface. So naturally, we sampled this quite intensively, and we do have some hammer scale that was identified on site coming out of this. So this semi-robust layer also then started to seal the core of our site, and as we started come through it, we'd started to discover a vast intensity of cut pit and post features beneath this. And this section drawing, I hope, to some extent illustrates that relationship, where we have an upper section of plough soil coming down onto a relatively stable layer which had deep organic underneath, and then we come through on the bottom left to start getting into that intense layer of cut pit and post features. Now, to give you an idea of the volume I'm talking about, we recorded 1,200 different contexts on this site. So each context is an archaeological stratigraphic unit of a cut or a fill feature. We recovered 900 different soil samples from different contexts. There was a huge amount of pit and post activity on this site, all within this very small 25 metre by 20 metre area. we have an incredible intensity of repeated activity. This is a typical shot of the interior of that area. I decided you might not be thrilled with me boring you to tears of the whole series of these photographs showing effectively the same thing, which is an intense recutting of pits and posts over and over, being cut in the same small portion of ground on this one small chunk of hillside. There was no clear suggestion of form, and one of our great struggles in post-excavation analysis, which we're going on to do, will be to try and tease apart what is happening in this area and whether we can tease out pattern. There were some clear areas where we found evidence for smaller shelters, structures, or partitions within this enclosure. And this is one of those examples where we've got a clear line of driven stakes or posts that have been driven into the subsoil rather than cut and packed into them. We also had some features in the interior that were slightly larger, one of which is a stretch of ditch or trough in the centre of the site, which appeared to be very good at retaining water. And this stretch of trough, which is a rather laden term, wasn't there to drain the interior because it sat in the centre bottom of the site and did not run out of it. So we're building up a complex picture of features that are appearing in this site. We did get an awful lot of material culture coming out, and some of those were more domestic occupation in nature. We have this rather nice fragment of an oil shale bracelet, reflective of day-to-day life and personal adornment, most likely from its size for children, and broadly from the late Bronze Age to Iron Age in date. It has a long currency. In terms of pottery coming off our site, that material was relatively robust, and the sherds we have look very much of a late Bronze Age or early Iron Age in date and form. And that at the moment is, with the cast bronze objects, our dominant dating evidence, which means obviously until we get into providing absolute dates for this site, we have to have some degree of caution, but at the same time it is as robust as we can be at this point. So at this stage, looking at our site, Area B, we've got a very anomalous site. At one point, it's anomalous relative to the landscape in which it sits. The West of Scotland Archaeology Service, quite reasonably, and our archaeological consultant got increasingly nervous at the volume of archaeology we were digging in Area B, and we ended up stripping quite a large area of hillside around it. So in this image, you can see in a rather nice sort of lilac mauvey sort of purple colour, Area B in the centre, and we have a whole series of other areas around it which were fully stripped out to ensure that what we weren't seeing was a concentration of archaeological features that would be repeated elsewhere on this hillside and would be there for months and months and irritate our client to death by never leaving. Happily for them, and interestingly for us, as we stripped out those larger areas, we had nothing like the intensity of features. We went to a very slight background scatter of pits and post holes. So our site is anomalous in this landscape. At the same time, it's quite a remarkably unusual site in terms of the archaeological record. We have a series of enclosures of differing forms encircling our hollow on an otherwise gentle slope. We have an intensity of features within those enclosures. We don't have any apparent coherent roof structure that we've been able to identify to group them together. We definitely have evidence of ironsmithing. Reasonably, we have evidence of bronze founding going on site as well, and we have some smelting evidence as well. And we have material culture that happily sits in the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age. Now, that's a tantalizing set of statements, and it leads you as an archaeologist to immediately go and desperately read Scarf. For those of you who aren't familiar with Scarf, this is the Scottish Archaeological Research Framework. For any of you who haven't browsed it and read portions of it, I strongly recommend it to you. It is a very useful way to realise how deeply in trouble you are with an archaeological site you're looking at and having to explain to people. So this is a very nice quote, which I like underlining pieces. I will read it for those of you not good with the English language. I always like lecturers at university who read out from their own slides, so I feel obliged to do it to you. I'm sorry. There is currently no evidence for ore smelting dating to the Bronze Age in Scotland, let alone an actual workshop. The absence of workshops means that the evidence, beyond examining the objects, derives from a small selection of bronze tools such as anvils. This is a remarkable situation, which those who prepared the SCARF document were very blunt and honest about. We have a significant number of bronze objects from Scotland, and the understanding of how they were produced derives entirely from the interrogation of those objects. There is a shortfall in the ability to identify where those objects were created or the processes by which they are created by looking at the locations, because we just can't identify them. We have been able to recognize from late Bronze Age copper alloy objects that they were predominantly made of recycled metals. We don't recognize a large-scale input of fresh ores at this point. We're gathering up, recycling metals and putting them out again into circulation. Very much a reduce, reuse, recycle strategy adopted so many councils now to our bins and rubbish. This is really just a Bronze Age strategy being redeployed as a new idea. So in that context, when we're looking at having evidence of bronze founding and ironsmithing, we start being in very strange lands indeed. Now, the situation of the absence of evidence is one of the things that has in part driven a historical approach to consider itinerant and peripatetic bronze founders moving between our occupation sites, plying their craft. And this used to be quite a popular interpretation. And it was used to explain the presence of moulds, for instance, on some of our occupation sites from this period, though it never, I think, gained very good traction. And it is a very strange way of creating rootless and sort of almost impoverished craftspeople, which fit very poorly into our comprehension of prehistoric societies, which appear to not reflect that behavior very well. So what I'd like to try and do is think about our site and think about that broader settled landscape within which it sits, and try and escape the bounds of where we were machining to look at a landscape that a Bronze Age mind may have recognized and thought about. So we need to look at our settled landscape like Donegal across the water, and we have Old Hill to the immediate south, which reasonably could have had late Bronze Age antecedents. These are our occupation sites, which lie very short walks away. So going back, Area B is our red circle to the rear of Hunterston B on this slide, sat on the north side of our peninsula with Goldenberry Hill to the south of us. Old Hill is sat to the southern end of that same peninsula, an opposed location going down the ridge of Goldenberry Hill. Is that a relation? Is that explaining a way in which the two sites have been located separate from each other? The other thing we must always remember about the Clyde when we step deep back into prehistory is that this is an area of steadily falling sea levels. We need to envisage a sea level that's slightly higher. And this is an atrociously haphazard schoolboy attempt to illustrate where we might consider an area of maritime influence coming in. The Clyde is constantly still uplifting as a result of rebound from the Loch Lomond re-advance. We need to envisage that our low-lying sites were even more low-lying than they were. Now, if you'll remember back to the 18th century mapping, the ground to the east of us, which is on the left of this picture, was boggy, moss-like ground in the mid-18th century. We must reasonably make that wetter and more unpalatable moving back into prehistory and bring our shoreline in towards our site. At which point you start envisaging a hammerhead peninsula, which is much more then dominated by our occupation site at the southern end of that hammerhead, controlling at least the land access up. Obviously, marine access to this site would have been exceptionally good. I also want to outrageously steal from what I think is one of the finest illustrated series of regional archaeologies you ever got. These were the Heinemann regional archaeologies, which I buy enthusiastically every time I see them because I think they are beautifully illustrated, and that alone is why I'm using it. But To steal ruthlessly from them and look at the late Bronze Age in the southwest, here is Hunterston, sat in the middle of this southwest distribution. To the west, we have Donegal, where we have a whole series of moulds recovered from the occupation site there in contexts which suggest a deliberate deposition and the management of that mould. We also have some from Ardrossan. We have in the landscape around a number of founders' hoards. Founders' hoards are a way of starting to understand hoards which have broken and damaged bronze objects in. The suggestion that these objects are being gathered together to be recycled in this late Bronze Age tradition. Is this the scale that we should be looking at our site? A hub with a whole series of spokes going out to these neighbouring occupation sites and more distant hoard sites. When we look at Hunterston, should we envisage it in a much larger cultural landscape that extends out across Ayrshire and the islands of the Clyde? And try and understand that when we're missing elements of a metal working tradition, are these the locations we need to go and find them? So what I'm trying to suggest is, do we have something really quite astonishing on this fairly obscure Ayrshire hillside at the start of the first millennium BC? Do we have an open-air workshop? That's visualization that was created for a public display for Hunterston shows a view from the northeast, looking into a visualization of the later phase of this site, where we have our continuous fence or palisade arcing around and tailing off to the east, enclosing an area where there appears to be craft industry going on. We clearly have ferrous iron working on site. We also appear to have non-ferrous, predominantly copper alloy working and traces of bronze founding. And we even have the suggestion of smelting on site, with some of those tap slags suggesting they may be, if we are incredibly fortunate, copper. So is it a reasonable leap to start suggesting we have this very rare of beast, a founder's workshop, with the missing elements such as the moulds or the large volume of scrap being within our broader cultural landscape? To try and argue to you this is a very reasonable case, I want to turn to a very good recent PhD prepared by a student at Sheffield on Bronze Age metalworking called Fregney. And if anybody listens to this and knows how to pronounce that correctly and I've made a fool of myself, I apologise now. She did a fascinating PhD called The Complete Metalsmith. And in that, she looked in great depth at the ritual inherent in metalworking, using ethnographic parallels and historical parallels to consider the potential character of pre-literate crafts skills. And this is a short quotation from it. The skillful creation of objects is anchored in repeated practice, such as carefully laying out tools before commencing work, or the rhythmic acts necessary for the object's completion. This is highlighting that the creation of ritual to communicate and learn craft processes is incredibly important to give confident and repeatable outcomes. What she was seeing and communicating is that ritualization of craft processes is a way of making it a predictable outcome and a confident outcome to an industrial process. And this, to my mind, is what we have to be looking for. If we're going to advocate that we have a metal workshop, a craft workshop, you have to show some reflection of how that craft industry is doing this ritualization to deliver consistent, repeated output. Because we're not looking at itinerant use, we're trying to argue for a consistent, repeated use of this site. And that's where we now are starting to go with understanding our deep organic soil. We have a progressive build-up of material in this central hollow, where we have material brought in again and again, and a progressive build-up of materials and forming of surfaces, work surface in the interior. But much more importantly, we have this repetition of cutting of pits and post holes again and again in this tightly defined same area. Where we're going at the moment is can we start recognize that this unusual, hugely intensive array of features is almost a tangible written text of a craft process that is repeated again and again on our site. And in fact, through interrogating the traces of that craft process within those features, can we start recognizing through that detritus such as these tap slags, can we start actually at least partially reading that text? Can we escape the trap of understanding the technological processes in the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age being from the objects back to start looking at these processes from the other way around, actually working from the locations where the processes were undertaken? So that's not much of a challenge. I'm hopeful that will go straight forward and nobody will be critical of it at all. At the same time, I think we have to test and challenge and rationalize this changing pattern of enclosure. So very nicely, the artist who created this reconstruction drawing gave us both phases of enclosure in one reconstruction drawing. Around our nicely upstanding, broadly phase 2 series of palisades, we have the rotting stumps of our post-defined enclosure that preceded it. We need to start thinking about these enclosures. If we are saying this is a coherent long-term use of this hollow for industrial craft processes, why do they change the form of enclosure that surrounds it? What is the prompt for that? Why does our earlier enclosure, why is it typified by massive timbers with grand entrances, and why is that cast away? And what we want to start considering is that reflective of the technological process undertaken on site as much as anything. So integral to the circuit of posts is the appearance of short runs, sometimes with marked breaks, and the massive entrance structure from the opposed L-shaped timber settings. This is potentially a permeable enclosure, allowing sight and movement into it, but it defines a very formal access processional route into the interior, and then another threshold as you enter the very core and the deeper portion of the site. It's orientated on the southeast. Should we start being interested in the fact that it's orientated on the rising sun? In contrast, our palisades enclosure showed to be constantly reworked, rebuilt. It appears to be some sort of iterative process of screening that is renewed on a regular basis. It doesn't have formal entrances. It has big breaks in its circuit, particularly in the northeast section, with no ability to reference the southeast at all in their form. So why did we change from apparently a permeable enclosure with a strong entrance to screens? Could we be seeing our technological change mirrored in the physical structure of the site? And this is where I really start going out on a limb. And these are the bits that will be edited out of this in future years, so I can deny vigorously I ever made these suggestions. Can we start thinking that our earlier enclosure is linked into bronze founding? Bronze founding hides its product, casts it in a mould, which is then broken open to reveal the new object formed from the molten metal. Very much a public display of a dramatic magical transformation. Are the processional entrances there to enable the managed parade of raw materials, of broken tools, broken objects to be brought into this manufacturing area, to be turned back into new copper alloy tools? Returned to the community, revived, restored and renewed and taken back out, maybe transported away with the moulds to return to the occupation sites across the water at Donegal. Is that a credible argument? Indeed, then can you consider that the move to the palisades, is that a technological change? Are we seeing the demise of one tradition and the genesis of iron smithing in the second, where you move to a technological situation where you have a blunt and obvious hammering of malleable metal, and you either want to screen it and hide it to try and maintain some of the mystique, or you've given up and it's an entirely technological approach to sheltering hearths and working areas. And That's why I put up this Stuart Needham quote, which I think is very important when you're considering any archaeological site, but especially one where we may have industrial transformation. Yet consideration of the demise of one tradition may be vital to explanation of the genesis or formulation of its successor. At some point, ironsmithing must have been initiated on these arts. Was this undertaken in the same locations that bronze founding was? Were they running in parallel, or was there a marked break and change? And do we see in Hunterston a bronze founding workshop designed to be sympathetic to a ritualized craft process that has been adapted and altered to ironsmithing? A craft industry that, as the Iron Age would progress, will be domesticated into our conventional occupation sites. As we move deeper into the Iron Age, ironsmith is confidently found on our Iron Age sites, where at the same time as doing this work, we're doing post-excavation on an Iron Age site from Auchrannie and Brodick, where we have clear evidence of ironsmithing in a conventional Iron Age settlement site. So is there a period where it is held apart before being so integrated into normal occupation? At the same time, while that might be the demise of our site entirely, the abandonment of this very unusual and intensive use of our location, we should also ask a question of why do we have a genesis of metalworking at this location? Why was this hollow on this hillside selected, utilised and chosen? And we have to potentially think about it as being an unusual location on an otherwise blank hillside. Was it a liminal area at distance from occupation sites that was chosen as suitable for this rather unpleasant, strange and magical craft process? In terms of genesis, I think we should also look back. We cannot obscure or hide from the fact that earlier back in the Bronze Age, and I freely admit we're looking back 1,000 years here, the flows of either ore, alloy or tools coming into Scotland was predominantly coming from southwest Ireland, flowing up and through. And as Needham nicely identified in a very catchy phrase, that flow, as it lands into Scotland, lands in a flow control area. And moving through that flow control area, it then moves on to net accumulation zones on our east coast. Now, Hunterston sits smack bang in the middle of the identified flow control zone for those materials coming from Ireland across into the west coast of Scotland. Are we seeing in this portion of the Clyde a long-standing tradition of a significance and relationship to metalworking? Should we be considering that maybe some of the genesis of our site may relate back to this older tradition of Irish metal flowing through this area and on? Was it in this period that our site was forged, or an association or recognition of the importance of metalworking created? So it's very true to say we have a lot of work to do. What I presented here this evening is quite speculative, contentious and dangerous, given the absence of bronze founding sites we have in Scotland, let alone ones that may straddle a transition into ironsmithing. But I think it's very important that we do put this concept out, that we run the risk of being harassed, hopefully not on Twitter. We appear to have a remarkable site that's formed at a remarkable time, reflected in its fabric, technological and social innovation, even revolution, and perhaps the end of the Bronze Age in Scotland. All of these are hinted at in our incredibly small site here, nestled behind the nuclear power stations at Hunterston. And I think it's very ironic that that white heat of the 20th century in the nuclear power stations should have protected and sheltered to its rear maybe the white heat of the start of the Iron Age. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. Before he started speaking tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I teased him about the title of his talk, that was Hunterston Power Station really there in the Bronze Age? And perhaps he answered that question in a funny sort of way there at the end. But anyway, can I throw this open to comments or questions from the floor?
Tom, I was taking interest in the castle now at Kilruskin, which you showed on your map, Roy's map there. In the context of what you've been saying, do you know anything about it? Is it interconnected? Is there any information regarding it?
Tragically, I shall look blank here. I'm afraid I've not looked out that far.
All I know about it is inquiries made. It's not clear. The records are very vague, whether it was an artificial mound or not. It lies, obviously a name like Kilruskin is very interesting. There are records of having a stone-lined enclosure of some sort, but it lies very close to the area you're describing.
I think this is one of the real problems. We're about to hopefully embark upon the post-excavation analyses. We've just been finalising them with WOSAS. And one of the problems we have within any piece of development archaeology is when we attempt to embed it within that broader landscape of academic understanding, we have limited capacity to go out and interrogate other sites at any level if they've not entered richly into the archaeological record, simply because our client quite reasonably starts saying, you appear to be looking at ground which is nowhere near our development site. But I think it is important that we will have to look and try and identify what may be the broader cultural landscape with great clarity.
Can I say something about it? Yeah. I think I know the site you're talking about, and my memory from childhood days, having been brought up round about there, was that the site at Kilruskin might have been rather similar to the double site at it's Glen Head on the shore just to the south of Sea Mill that was excavated a number of years ago by Alistair Henry, which had a couple, if you like, proto-souterrains underneath sort of Atlantic roundhouses. So I wonder if Kilruskin may be something similar to that. Just a thought. Yes,
Thank you. Can I ask first whether you have any clay mould fragments which would indicate what bronze objects were actually made on the site? You showed a couple of bronze objects but which in theory could have been brought in from outside. And the second question is, did you recover or could you recover in post-excavation any stratigraphy to separate out bronze working and iron working, or was it all mixed up as you might expect if they spent decades trampling about in the same area the size of this room?
So, moulds, no, tragically, so far identified, we have been unable to identify any moulds within the material we brought back from site. And that is obviously one of our problems, which is quite substantial. In terms of differentiation of material, we've taken a series of cubienitins coming through the organic soil in the hope that when we're making up soil thin sections from that, we'll be able to differentiate layers and maybe able to recognize introduction material. And obviously, we've sampled from the floor levels where they've been clear and discrete, which may be able to differentiate processes. Our great hope, in fact, rests with the multiple pallet loads of soil we have from the individual features. And so with the repetitive process, one would hope that we may be able to tease apart a phasing sequence and recognize changes in the industrial debris incorporated into those through time. So we may be able to separate out. But the problem is, as you recognize, we're an incredibly small area. And so clearly separating a phased technological change in the detritus being deposited will be a challenge. And it will be a challenge which I don't think will ever produce a very robust answer, because it's just not the nature of the stratigraphy.
But you do have other sites in Scotland where excavation is within some kind of succession of bronze working and iron working, and most of them probably maybe somewhere in the audience, most recently you and Mackay's discussion in the most recent journal of the sheep delhi site. And even at Yarnshof, where you must have had a workshop like this, only it doesn't survive, or it wasn't excavated. There seems to have been a sequence between the well-known bronze working and the less well-known iron working. The problem was that immediately successive, was it a few years later or 2 or 3 centuries?
Exactly, and this is our great hope, that if we can tease apart, if we can give a robust dating to that sequence, that we can maybe contribute to that. I mean, we definitely have both processes on site, but whether we can show them to be running in parallel or sequentially will be one of our challenges.
Yes. And I'll make, sorry, I've got the floor, I'll make a final point on the basis that I'm too was pleased you showed Jack Scott's excellent little book, but you did mention that just up the road, more or less in East Ayrshire, you have the 6 or 7 shields found normally known after beef, but found at Lupton Ridge Farm. Now these are top of the range bronze working. We know what was done, but we can't replicate it. And this must have been done by craftsmanship of a different order from churning out socketed axes, swords or everything, which was quite straightforward and which I firmly believe had nothing magical about it at all. But this area, this part of Scotland, which you might not think of as particularly rich in the Bronze Age. And the other thing you need, of course, to go and get is your copy of Alec Morrison's little book, but actually produced some of the material that was as good as anything that would anywhere in Britain or Ireland.
Indeed, I wouldn't dispute it. I think the problem is there has been no rigour of explaining and communicating that well. And I think that's common with so much in the southwest, and Ayrshire has suffered greatly from that.
Could you tell me from analysis, is there any indication of where the original ores for the bronze came from?
That will be part of what we'll be doing. We'll be looking at all the slags that have come out and the objects. But generally, in the late Bronze Age at least, the bronze that's looked at, the copper is an amalgam. It's a merging of many different sources. And the iron, when you start going to iron, is predominantly bog iron. Yes, and that's one of the things, as you move into the Iron Age, there's much easier access to raw material.
Okay. Thanks for that great presentation. The enclosure, when we look at the Mar Lodge enclosure, so it's much.
Yeah.
I was wondering about the different materials that are out there, the shale work, the bracelets, really nice. All Hill has a huge amount of shale work in there. Is there anything?
There's very small volumes of shale. I think we've got, that is the good piece of, that was the good nice bit I showed, to show that we did find things other than metalworking material and pot. So we don't have a huge volume. It is dominated after you're looking at the metalworking and the pottery is hammerstones, and that really is our staple diet of material culture coming off this. So I don't think we're going to get any good ability to connect that way.
Just a question about the two enclosures. The first, you suggested ritual aspects to that.
Well, it's always fun to do that.
Yeah. The second or secondary enclosure, what I didn't pick up was whether you were suggesting ritual from that, or perhaps more functional. Because my impression of it is potentially prevailing winds.
Yeah, absolutely, and that was very much our foible of whether it is related to that, and you're looking at screening, effectively screening, environmental screening, and that's a potential. But it's a very interesting cheat to say, it's prevailing, and we've discussed that in-house, because it's great, because I don't think paleoclimatology is ever going to offer to us what the prevailing winds in the Late Bronze Age were, so we can happily say that and nobody can dispute it. It's definitely an option. I think that is it. It looks and feels a lot more functional.
The troughing or trench you've got in the middle of your site there.
Yes.
It's obviously not drainage because it's going.
Yeah.
But what part of the industrial processes you're seeing on site is that related to?
Yes, I shall be expecting the people doing the analytical work on that to give a... No, I mean, one of the options, obviously, you have to think of is quenching in ironworking. It's an option. But then it may just be for water management, because literally, it was a hard site to work. We had a lot of water coming through that. If this is an open-air workshop, there's a lot of water coming through it, and it may simply be a sump. You may be looking at just a practical coping with that environment, as opposed to getting a deliberate holder of a water body.
In which case, it also secondary quenching, it just happens to be a secondary use site.
Just a mundane question. Can you make a guesstimate as to the human population on the site?
No. As we're looking at now, it doesn't clearly exhibit any of the characteristics you'd look for suggesting occupation. That doesn't mean it doesn't have it, but in that sense, we're not looking at it as an occupation site. In terms of size, it's a large enough area for multiple people to work in. Whether that was true, I don't think we'll ever be able to comment, effectively on, and in any way that isn't highly speculative to the point that it's our own preconceptions being placed upon the site.
You mentioned in a girl several times, and it does have moulds. Could you speculate what you might see the relationship of a site like Dinnergirl with the...
I do hope the filming's finished by this point, because I'm getting deeper and deeper into a mire here that I feel I'll never get back out of. I would see a potential relationship of the partnership of the mould with the object. And as such, an object returning with its mould would appear to be a potential association, and therefore is part of a more ritualized process of returning an object to an occupation site, and whoever, by whatever process, commissioned or requested that and received it. And then it's the deposition of those moulds. We haven't looked at it deeply yet, but my understanding of the Donegal moulds is that they're placed in quite deliberately curated and buried in non-sort of casual discard way. And as such, you may be looking at a process then of the sort of burial of those moulds.
This might be really tangential, but the speculation about the use of the site and so on could be confirmed perhaps by some evidence associated with how materials arrived there and the rate from. And I'm wondering if I understood your presentation correctly, and materials coming from Ireland, then it could either there's some evidence that it has been buried under Hunterston Power Station, or conceivably, given the hammerhead drawing that you offered, if you came round the north of that hammerhead and then down there could be evidence there inland of sites that then serve both of the sites you're talking about, north and south.
Entirely possible. In terms of the Irish connection, that was very much looking back 1,000 years to the flows of metal out of southwest Ireland at that time. But I think it is interesting how this site articulates with the Clyde. I think that can't be escaped. That the sitting in the sea lanes as it does, sitting at this point of a crossing point across to Bute, and the head of the sort of open water of the much broader Clyde, there should be potential for shoreline sites. And yes, we should have our shoreline available from the Late Bronze Age, Early Iron Age on that peninsula. But we have to question whether there would be an infrastructure built in that manner, as opposed to the casual lost, abandonment, or discard of vessels, which has been shown at other locations. Because in some extent, you're in a traditional shallow draft crafts which are beached and drawn up, and you wouldn't see, I don't think, an infrastructure for that. But you could have the entombment of lost and abandoned vessels, potentially.
Your speculation mood, bring one point that the
Yes.
so-called harbour.
Yes.
I know you've got more information hasn't come to you yet. Any thoughts on it?
It's not Bronze Age. I think I'd be quite... it's a very awkward one in the sense that we have to accept that sea levels are progressively lowering, and it's a challenge to see that harbour working now. It's been floated as Roman. I don't like it for that. I like it for some venture in the 17th, 18th century. But that's my personal preference of where I'd place it. I think it's very challenging to see how that will ever be dated if we cannot find an historical inference or reference to it. I think it's going to be one of those ones everybody can float a boat. Oh dear, that was a dreadful one. I think I'll stop at that point.
Well, thank you very much indeed, everybody, for your comments and thoughts on a very good, fascinating talk. Let me just say what a pleasure it is for me as president of the Society of Antiquaries to be over here as a guest of our friends and colleagues in GAS. And just looking round at you very handsome young people, I mean, I'm sure recognise several faces that we see at our meetings in Edinburgh as well, and that is good. I hope very much that this will just be the first of many good examples of cooperation between the two societies, and certainly if we can have other speakers and talks of the calibre of the one we've had tonight, we can only go from strength to strength. Tom said at various times in the course of his talk about how rotten he was to his employees, making them work hard without proper clothing and not listening to them complaining. I rather think he must have been nice to some of them, at least some of the time. I do happen to know that Tom runs a very good company which does good work and has been very much involved in very successful community archaeological projects. I cannot believe that they would have had any success if he was as bad as he managed to paint. So at least some of what he said tonight I take with a pinch of salt. Again, despite the health warnings he was given, not necessarily the overall conclusions, which I think were presented in a very masterly and thought-provoking way. As perhaps befits somebody who's settled in that cultural capital of Kilwinning, he's not been content to actually sort of home in just on the site itself, but he's expanded out his thoughts. Ayrshire, Bute, where's this going to go? Are you going to take in the rest of the island as well, Tom? I mean, we'll watch this space anyway because it's a fascinating process, and we're very grateful indeed to Tom for speaking to all of us tonight. So let's give him our thanks in the usual way.